I'd like to welcome you all to a Nitro Oceania seminar. We still have some people joining us, but while they join us, I'd just like to introduce you to Nitro for those of you who are new to the organisation. Nitro is a network of organisational leaders fostering interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research and education within the Oceania region by regularly hosting events just like this one. My name's Rachel Parker. I'm a professor of innovation studies, and I'm a director of the Global Change Institute at the University of Queensland. So I'll be chairing today's seminar. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we're all living and working today. As we share our knowledge today, may we also pay respect to our elders, both past and present, as it is their knowledge and experiences that holds the key to the success of future generations. I'd like to advise that this seminar is actually being recorded. So if you want to remain anonymous, you should de-identify your video. If you would prefer your voice not to be recorded during questions, please use the chat function to post your questions anonymously. And where possible, I'll read those questions following the presentation during the question time. I would ask that participants turn off their video and microphone during the presentation. This presentation will run for 30 minutes, followed by questions. So I would very much like to welcome Professor Erin Leahey, who will be presenting today on the causes and consequences of universities' commitment to interdisciplinary research. Erin is director of the School of Sociology at the University of Arizona. She's an elected member of the Sociological Research Association. She's known largely for her work on science and scientific careers. Recently, she has focused on studying the costs, benefits, and precursors of interdisciplinary research at both the individual and organisation levels. She's published extensively in leading international sociology journals, and her research has been funded by the National Science Foundation and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, where she held a fellowship position. Welcome to Nitro Oceania, Erin.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. I am going to, I think, share, I can't seem to do that. We just did a run through. I'm going to share my screen, and then you can all tell me if you see a big slide. Is that working? Okay. Thank you, Kara. What a wonderful opportunity to share some of my work with you. I often speak to very different audiences, and I think you're just the perfect audience. And I hope that some of the work that I've done over the last 3 years is relevant and useful to you. I will also say I'm perfectly happy to take questions, or for people to kind of jump in, just unmute yourselves and ask a question as I go. I'm happy to do that, and I look forward to your comments and questions and learning about your own experiences at your own institutions, fostering interdisciplinarity more broadly. So this is what I'm going to be sharing with you today is really a broad overview of three papers that resulted from a grant. That was I think it extended into four-year grant funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation. And my co-investigator is Sandra Berenger, a former graduate student who's now an assistant professor elsewhere, and a number of graduate students as well. So probably everybody here maybe has a definition of interdisciplinarity in mind. There are also a number of articles, one by Wagner et al., one by Jacobs and Frickel in the Annual Review of Sociology. There are a bunch of others out there really trying to come up with a definition of interdisciplinary research. And this is the one, it's a whopper, it's a big one that I use to guide my research, but it's very broad, right? And the focus is on the kind of domain spanning, whether those domains are, disciplines or techniques or tools or data or theories or what have you. We probably all also know the goals of interdisciplinary research, which are to advance fundamental understanding, solve problems that one discipline can't seem to solve on its own, get a more comprehensive perspective, overcome conceptual blinders, and ideally produce innovative and really transformative, groundbreaking work. So before I embarked on this university level study that I'm going to be sharing snippets of with you, I started by studying scholars and papers and research teams. And this work is based on interviews of scholars in the humanities. It's also based on a combination of quantitative and qualitative research on scholars who are housed in centers that are called, industry, university, collaborative research centers. And so about 900 scientists and all of their papers. And I summarized both of these studies in a recent paper in European Review. Science policy, at least in the US, I know less about the Australia context and I'm eager to learn, but science policy in the United States is focused on what funding agencies can do to support interdisciplinary research. This is a book, the one on the left is published in 2005. The more recent one, Convergence, was published just a few years ago. But universities, which perform more than half of the basic research conducted in the United States, can also foster interdisciplinary research, which I will just call IDR. So what we did in this project, it was a 3-year project. We spent about 2 years collecting data. This was with multiple research assistants. We collected tons of data on 156 universities, research universities in the United States. We also used a bunch of different methods, and our goal was to answer 3 main research questions. So the first one is, can we even measure a university's commitment to interdisciplinary research? How can we possibly get at that to understand the level of commitment at each university? And if and when we can do that, let's take a look at how it is distributed across universities, right? Are they all strongly committed to interdisciplinary research, or some less strongly committed to interdisciplinary research? And this paper is published in Scientometrics in 2019. The second question, and I'll go into each one of these in quite a bit detail, 5 minutes or so each during this talk. The second question is, what factors influence university level commitment to IDR? We call this our precursors paper. We're interested in the things that kind of promote commitment to interdisciplinary research, again, studying these 156 universities. This paper was published in 2020 in the journal Research in Higher Education. And then the third research question, we kind of call this our consequences paper. Does universities' commitment to interdisciplinary research spur research activity, and especially interdisciplinary research activity? And this paper was published in the journal Research Policy in 2020. So what I'd like to do is go into each one of these kind of questions in a little bit more detail. The first question is about measuring this construct. We might think of it as a latent construct called universities' commitment to interdisciplinary research. The second one is about what catalyzes such commitment. And then the third one is about what are the consequences? What are the implications of that commitment? So here is our massive conceptual.
So you've got the 26.
Maybe there's a question. No. Here's our conceptual model. Smack in the middle is the first kind of latent construct of interest to us, and this is universities' commitment to interdisciplinary research. Mostly given timing and data availability, we measure this during one academic year, which is 2012 to 2013. That's the focus of the first question, is like, how do we get at that? Let's see, I think, hold on 1 second. I think I can do this. There we go. Okay. So this concept right here, this is the focus of question 1. How do we measure this, right? And then the second question of interest to us focuses on causes. And just to have a time-sensitive design, we measure these potential causes or precursors or things that might influence a university's commitment to IDR. We measure them in 2008 to 2011. And the two of interest to us are top-down support. So here we're thinking like what the universities are doing, maybe the provost or the president, right? What kinds of maybe carrots and sticks are at their disposal. And what's particularly interesting to us is the bottom-up engagement, the people at the university doing a lot of the work and the research, the postdocs, the grad students, the faculty. Are they the ones that are encouraging the university to increase their commitment to interdisciplinary research? And then the third question is all about the consequences. And again, for a time-sensitive design, what we do is we measure these a little bit after the time when we measure universities' commitment to IDR. And we're interested in assessing the effects on not just research activity generally, but on interdisciplinary research in particular. So the first question, how can we measure universities' commitment to interdisciplinary research? So what we do is we focus on what we call structural commitment to interdisciplinary research. So this is deeper and longer lasting than maybe other forms of commitment, and it requires money and sometimes reorganization, maybe new units, maybe changing up units. And by units, I mean centers and departments, research centers and departments. A number of folks have focused on centers and the role of centers and departments, and that what they often presume is that centers are interdisciplinary. The reason they exist is because the research that they are doing can't be done in one department alone, so you need a center to do it. So they are inherently interdisciplinary, and we interrogate that a little bit. And they also focus on departments. And I think the presumption there is often that departments map on very closely to disciplines. And so departments are typically monodisciplinary, whereas the centers are more interdisciplinary. But we assert that not only the absolute and relative number of these units matters for a university and its structural commitment to IDR, but the nature of them does. Are the centers actually all interdisciplinary? Are the departments really all monodisciplinary? So a little bit more on centers. These are a primary way that universities engage in IDR. They're developed to promote interdisciplinary interaction. They complement, as Barry Bozeman's work, complement but don't replace departments, and are really, as I said earlier, presumed to be interdisciplinary. So the number of centers, the ratio of centers to departments may indicate interdisciplinary research, and the fraction of research centers that are interdisciplinary may also do that, right? If we don't presume that all centers are interdisciplinary. A little bit on departments. The sheer number of departments may indicate interdisciplinary research. So new departments often reflect a blending of previously distinct fields, and yet departments rarely disappear. So just the number of departments, which is going to vary from university to university, could indicate a commitment to interdisciplinary research. But of course, some fields are more interdisciplinary than others. I've given some examples here. And so the fraction of departments that are interdisciplinary may also be informative, right? So the number of interdisciplinary departments divided by the total number of departments may be indicative of a commitment level. So the data we used in this first paper, which was all about trying to measure this construct, again, we gathered it from 156 research universities in the United States. We gathered data on centers. So at these 156 universities, we gathered data on 9,211 centers. And the data of interest to us were, the sheer number, yes, but also the names of each one of these centers and the subject headings, kind of think of keyword descriptors of each one of these centers. We also collected data on 12,323 departments. And this was we went to each university's website to do this. And the data of interest here, in addition to just the sheer number of departments, is the department's name, for example, environmental science. To measure structural commitment to IDR, we combine two techniques. The first one is machine learning. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, it's semi-supervised machine learning, and it starts with good old-fashioned kind of manual content analysis, right? Coding of units. So both the research centers and the departments, are they interdisciplinary or not? And this requires a training data set that we developed, and we said, yes, this center appears to be interdisciplinary, this center does not. We feed that into the machine and hopefully it learns from it, and we document that it does learn from it, and then it can classify the rest of the 12,000 departments, for example. So we didn't have to classify or code 12,000 departments all by ourselves. The second is confirmatory factor analysis. That's what CFA stands for. This is a statistical approach that is helpful for measuring latent concepts like structural commitment to interdisciplinary research. So super quickly, this is just two universities, university number 1, university number 156. We have the name of the research center, and the output from machine learning will give us a binary, just as we gave it as input, for example, data. On the real data, it will return, yes, the center is interdisciplinary, or no, it isn't, the 0 value, right, for each one of those centers. And then what we do is we calculate university level counts. So how many interdisciplinary centers does this university have? And what is the, the fraction of centers that are interdisciplinary? So for University 1, there were 2 interdisciplinary research centers and 3 research centers overall, pretend, for a total of about two-thirds. And what we do is we use these university level counts and ratios as input for this confirmatory, as data, right? Input for a confirmatory factor analysis model with 4 indicators. And this is, we tried a few, as one should, and this is the best fitting model. So we have 4 indicators of universities' commitment to IDR, or their structural commitment to IDR, based on the kind of structural organization, or organizational structure, I should say. So we have number of departments over here. We have the what a lot of people think might indicate interdisciplinarity, which is the ratio of research centers to departments. And then here we have, well, what fraction of research centers are actually interdisciplinary? The number of ID, or interdisciplinary research centers, over all research centers. And we do the same thing over here for departments. And this is the distribution of what's called the factor score. You could call it, it is a variable. It does vary. It is quantitative, it's numeric, and it indicates structural commitment to interdisciplinary research. And what we've done here is just put a few examples. Of course, we have there are 156 universities, each has a value, right? Each has a factor score representing its structural level of structural commitment to interdisciplinary research. And we put here just a few universities in the US that a lot of people are likely to know, but also the ones that show up in a lot of the research, especially the more qualitative and case-oriented research on interdisciplinarity. For example, Stanford. And UC Riverside is also known for a lot of its cluster hiring initiatives, for example. So we achieved our goal of developing a quantitative university level measure of structural commitment to IDR. That was the first goal of question 1. And what we found when we looked at some of these characteristics of universities is that the universities that were well resourced and prestigious and that spent a lot of money on research and development, and the universities that have a medical school attached to them, they tend to have a high commitment to interdisciplinarity. Whereas technical universities, you may have remembered MIT was kind of on the left side of that last chart, MIT and Caltech and others, and those in the South, the southern part of the United States, tend to have a lower commitment to interdisciplinary research. Okay, so now we'll move on to the kind of the precursors, or what influences, why is it the case that some universities have a high commitment to interdisciplinary research and others have maybe medium and others have a low, right? So the outcome variable for this paper is that factor score that I just shared with you. right? And what we're doing is looking at top-down support. So this is stuff that administrators are doing, university administrators and provosts are doing and saying that may influence the university's commitment to IDR. But we're also looking at bottom-up engagement, what's actually being done on the ground by the researchers themselves. And so here again, for 156 universities, we spend a lot of time getting data from lots of different places, university websites. Some of you may be familiar with the survey of earned doctorates, HERD, IPEDS data, the Web of Science, as well as award data from both the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. To measure this top-down support that administrators might be providing, we downloaded a lot of textual data for each university. We grabbed strategic plans for kind of a series of years, and also speeches given by university presidents, which often have a lot of talk about the things that are of importance to them, that they are stressing and interested in. And again, we developed a way to code and classify whether a document measures, whether a document mentions interdisciplinary research, and if so, what is the sentiment associated with it? Is it positive? Is it neutral? Is it kind of negative? And so we capture both of those things, and we are able to generate a variable that we use, which is the number of positive mentions of interdisciplinarity across all a university's documents that we have, right? So it's the number of positive mentions. So how many times in this time period, this is 2008 to 2011, are folks at the university talking about interdisciplinarity in a positive way? Okay, the bottom-up engagement by researchers themselves. We look at publications. So this is the percent of publications that show up or are published in multidisciplinary journals. We look at PhDs, so the percent of PhDs awarded at that institution that spanned disciplines that were in 2 or more fields. And we also look at grants, the percent of NIH grants that are interdisciplinary, and then the same for the National Science Foundation. And so what we find in this second paper that is focused on the causes is that top-down administrative efforts promote structural commitment to IDR, but so do these bottom-up efforts by faculty, grad students, postdocs, especially the number of interdisciplinary PhD students that they graduate. We do find some differences between universities with medical schools and universities without medical schools, and I encourage you to read the paper if you're particularly interested in that. And lastly, the consequences. This was the third research question. Do such commitments, does a university's commitment to interdisciplinary research spur research activity in general? Is it good for research activity in general? So we're thinking like grants and publications. And is it especially good for interdisciplinary research activity? So we look at both of those. And again, we measure these at a slightly later point in time than we measure university commitment to interdisciplinary research, which is really about the structural commitment, right? Based on number of centers, number of departments, ratio of centers to departments, what fraction of their centers are actually interdisciplinary and the like. So that is the independent variable. That factor score is now the independent variable in this paper. And we're looking at its effect on research activity and interdisciplinary research in particular. I think I said a lot of this already. The key predictor is that factor score, structural commitment to interdisciplinary research as indicated by centers and departments. The outcomes of interest to us to capture research activity. What we do is we go to the Web of Science corpus and we grab articles that are affiliated with each of the universities of interest to us, about 156 of them. And we count up the sheer number of articles. They have to show up in the Web of Science. There are articles published that do not show up, that are not indexed in the Web of Science. So that's what we capture is number of articles published. We get that from the Web of Science. And then we also have the number of NIH grants awarded to each institution during this time frame of interest to us. This is the outcome. So this is about 2014 to 2017. We also have the dollar amount of every NIH grant. So we can sum up the total number of kind of research dollars awarded to each institution in the years of interest. And then for NSF grants, we could get the number, but not the dollar amount. So that's those things, those grants and articles capture research activity that's going on at the university during the period of interest to us. Now for interdisciplinary research activity, what we do here is we count up the number of interdisciplinary articles published. So it's not just the total number of articles, but also the type of publications. And we also grab the number and dollar amount of NIH grants with interdisciplinary activity codes. So the NIH has a series of activity codes. Some of these are very interdisciplinary, some of these are less so. And so that's how we code them. And then the National Science Foundation grants, there's a well, there are programs in the NSF. One of them, for example, is sociology. Another one where I've received a lot of my funding from is now called the Science of Science, right? That's another program. And then there are these grants you can receive that actually cut across programs, right? They call them cross-cutting, X-cut programs. And so we looked at the number of NSF grants each one of these universities has received that happens to be from a cross-cutting program. So these three or four things combined help us understand the level of interdisciplinary research activity that's going on at the university. And what we do is we control for size, research capacity, the region in the United States, the prestige of the university, revenue, whether it's a public or private institution, and the like. So the results from the third study, structural commitment to interdisciplinary research has a large effect on just general research activity, but especially it has a large effect on interdisciplinary research activity. So we looked at these different indicators of interdisciplinary research separately, and we found that structural commitment has a moderate and positive effect on the number of interdisciplinary publications produced. It also has a large and positive effect on the number of interdisciplinary grants received from NIH, as well as the dollar amount of those grants awarded to each university. It has no effect, however, on the interdisciplinary grants received from the National Science Foundation. And we've thought a little bit about this and gathered a little bit of data to try to understand why this might be the case. And I'm happy to maybe go back to this slide. I don't know, I've actually, when I share my screen, my clock went away. So I'm fearing maybe we're getting close to time, but we can certainly come back to this, especially if you have analogs in Australia, right? A funding agency that largely funds health-related research and medical research. And another one like the NSF that might be of interest to some folks. And so just to wrap up, some of the contributions of this project, this 3-year project that could not have been done without my amazing research team and research funding, is what we do is we developed a scalable university level measure of what we call structural commitment to interdisciplinary research. And to our knowledge, no one had ever done this before. Like how committed, my university is more committed to interdisciplinary than your university. Well, how do we know this, right? And so what we did by gathering tons of data on centers and on departments and analyzing it is we developed a measure of structural commitment to interdisciplinary research. We could also think about maybe other kinds of commitment that are less structural in nature that would also be interesting to measure. The second thing that we did is we found that there is no kind of one size fits all approach to increasing university commitment to interdisciplinary research. So institutional context matters. We found some differences between universities with and without medical schools. We found some differences between universities of different statuses and the like. And third, with respect to the consequences, we found that structural commitment to interdisciplinary research increases scholarly productivity and grant activity just in general, and especially interdisciplinary research and grant activity, at least when it comes to health-related research. I'll just end by some of you may be interested in research quality, right? Not just the amount of work that is being published, right? Or an amount of grants that are being done, but what about the quality of that work, right? I think a lot of the impetus for an enthusiasm for interdisciplinary research is that if we go back to that one of those early slides about the goals of interdisciplinary research, it's really to help produce really innovative, really groundbreaking work that maybe couldn't be done otherwise, right? So a university's structural commitment to IDR, what we find, has no effect on measures of traditional measures of research quality. We certainly can improve on these. For example, the number of highly cited researchers. This is actually a thing in the web of science. You could be a highly cited researcher. It doesn't affect the number of articles published in Nature and Science at the university level. It doesn't affect the number of Nobel Prizes or Fields Medals awarded to faculty at that university, the number of members of the National Academy of Sciences. It doesn't affect the number of prestigious external awards won either. So universities seeking to promote high impact research may need to move beyond structural commitments to interdisciplinary research. I will tell you briefly that one of the measures I've been working with recently on my current grant with Jason Owen Smith and Russ Funk. They've developed a measure of how disruptive a given paper is. And this is less about kind of disruptive, I'm thinking, Rachel, if you're interested in innovation, less about disruptive innovation and more about how a given paper kind of alters knowledge streams, right? And citation flows of, oh, but this paper is building on the work of this previous paper. And I'm also thinking about Rachel's introduction with reliance on previous generations, right? This measure of disruptive research activity is very much along those lines. And one of the things I would like to do going forward is look to see whether, for example, a university's structural commitment to interdisciplinary research prompts more disruptive work or research. That would be a fun thing to do. So I think what I'll do is stop there and maybe even stop sharing my screen so I can see more of you and see what kinds of questions people have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. That was such an excellent introduction to the work, the research that you've been doing on interdisciplinary research. And I think it gave us a great understanding of both the antecedents and consequences of commitment to interdisciplinary research. So while we open up the floor to questions, I'd just like to remind everyone, particularly those of you who came late, that we're actually recording this Zoom session. So if you would prefer to remain anonymous, please de-identify your video and feel free to add a question to chat anonymously. So for those of you who would like to ask a question, please either raise your hand using the Zoom function or add a question to chat, and Erin and I will seek to field those questions. So we already have one in, Erin. From Gabriel, who's asking, we have many in. So, so one of the questions, and I'll read this one out for you. Has your research generated interest among US universities and changed practices in terms of a commitment to interdisciplinary research? So, have you sparked a conversation, Erin, about interdisciplinary research?
This is what we all dream for, right? After we engage in research that actually, is useful and matters to people. The short answer is, there has been quite a bit of interest in this work. I do not know if the work has contributed to kind of a shift in practices, right, at the university level. I do know that a number of folks who have listened to this talk said, oh, I really want to know where my university is. What's my university's factor score? Where do we fall on this, this distribution with, MIT here and Harvard there, and where are we relative to other universities? And they contact us because they want the data, right? They want the right. So maybe that's informative to them to know where they are with, relative to their peers in terms of their structural commitment to interdisciplinary research. But I would like to know, Gabriel, I would like to know that the answer to that question. Hopefully, that's my answer.
So we have another question, Erin, that's trying to sort of go at the question of how you're looking at the impact of the interdisciplinary research. So you talked a lot about NIH funding, and of course we all have equivalents of NIH and the National Science Foundation funding in our own jurisdictions, but people are interested to hear about whether or not you have any evidence of the effects of interdisciplinary research on impact more broadly, so perhaps on policy, on industry, on community, on environment, and in particular societal impact?
No, I would love to do that kind of research. I think probably, I mean, it's harder to do, certainly harder to measure, but that makes it all the more imperative. And the one person who may be doing some work in this area is Ismail Rafols, who is now at Leiden in the Netherlands, who's done quite a bit on kind of research portfolios, at least at the national level, and maybe how interdisciplinarity or commitments have kind of spawned, maybe national commitments to, averting climate crisis and the like.
I'm also wondering, Erin, if you could make some comments on some of the antecedents to commitment to interdisciplinary research. So you mentioned things that your own research had examined, including commitments as represented in strategic plans or in presentation from provosts, for example. So for those in the audience who are leaders, academic leaders within research organizations, and who are seeking to promote interdisciplinary research, what sort of lessons does that work that you have on antecedents suggest for them?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think
just a reminder to people to mute if and to add a question to chat or raise your hand in the function.
The short answer, Rachel, to your question is that, especially to administrators in the audience, that your words do matter, right? And I don't mean just what you say, like this is written words, like in speeches, and we tried to look at mission statements, but they were, the availability was quite spotty. Strategic plans, right, that they matter. And one of the findings, at least at universities without medical schools, what we found is you kind of need both. You need kind of the buy-in from the researchers themselves who believe in this kind of work enough to actually conduct it and do it, and you need the support from the administrators, right? There was this kind of interaction effect between the top-down support and the bottom-up activity of the faculty members themselves.
And Ian Gordon, I noticed you have your hand up.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks, Erin. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Great.
Fantastic. And I love the way you've done some quantitative stuff out of the qualitative information. And it'd be nice to find out a bit more about the details, so I'll look at the papers. The question really is whether you saw in the antecedents any changes in leadership, where you could see a shift in the narrative around the top-down approach, which would, I think, allow you to see quite clearly where you might get that transition happening and what sort of things created that transition. Because leaders often are the ones who drive culture in an organization, and changes in leadership often very rapidly change the nature of the way in which centers and institutes and various other things are set up.
Yes. Yeah, and that would be amazing. I'm trying to think that the precursors we measured, there was a period of years there. It was like about 2008, 2011, probably because like not every university every year has a strategic plan. That would be a little suspect if they did, right? And so we had this kind of window, right? We do not, one of the things we did measure during that window is whether the university, there's this kind of new thing, a new position. There are a lot of new positions at American universities, but one of them that exists at some universities is a vice provost for interdisciplinary research. And there were very few of them, like 2 or 3. I just heard about it on, I don't know, social media. So I was like, what? This is a thing? Like you can do this as a job, right? But there were so few of them. We then got not the job description, but the webpage of the VPR, Vice Provost for Research, is called here in the United States, and took a kind of snapshot of the text describing that person's work. And if that happened to be interdisciplinary, then we're like, okay, that's close enough. You've got a VP for interdisciplinary research. But we do not have the data, at least on presidents, like university presidents, and whether there was a changeover during that time. If everything is just time or money, we could go get it, and that would be phenomenal. That would be fascinating to look at. I appreciate the recommendation.
Thanks, Ian. And Mark, you have your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Erin. That was incredibly illuminating to see, scholarly research into the role of interdisciplinary research. And in my field, we are sort of trending towards transdisciplinary research with an emphasis on our project and an external partner, as well as several disciplines being involved, as a way of generating impact. I just wondered if you have been able to look beyond the scope of interdisciplinary research with its internal rhetoric and transdisciplinary, which might give Australian academics a bit more range beyond relying on Australian Research Council funding, etc.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The short answer is no. I think it would be fascinating. I think it'd be really important. There's a lot of really rich theoretical conceptual work on differences between inter and multi and transdisciplinarity. I think measuring it is, at least in a quantitative way, is certainly more challenging. But again, that doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. That's the heart of my entire research career, is people say, oh, we can't measure these things. And I say, I'll find a way, right? And I'll try to do it, even if it's hard to replicate, because it requires tons of data and all sorts of new skill sets, at least for me, like computational sociology and the like. One project that I'm working on right now, I am really trying to distinguish the effects at the scholar level between engaging in interdisciplinary work that really does integrate disciplines from multidisciplinary work, which is just, oh, I wrote a paper about that, I wrote a paper about that, I wrote a paper about that, right? Kind of these separate, silos, if you will, right? But not transdisciplinarity yet.
Erin, just taking
Thanks.
another question from the chat space. We've had a question about the way in which you're measuring interdisciplinary research. So you did look a lot at the organizational structures, but we've had a question here about interdisciplinary research where it involves engagement with government and industry. So I think it also follows on from this kind of transdisciplinary concept as well, where you're bringing in stakeholders from outside the research context as part of the process. Have you got any evidence around that?
No, I'm speaking with a bunch of folks here at my own university who are kind of intrigued by this. And one of the studies I mentioned early on, an individual level study that was published in Administrative Science Quarterly, what we did there, we studied about 900 scholars who were affiliated with a center that got funding from NSF, and these centers are called, there were many of them distributed across the US, Industry University Collaborative Research Centers. So a lot of the folks affiliated with these centers were doing work that crossed domains from at least industry and academia, maybe not government as much, and many of them were also doing interdisciplinary research. So that's probably the closest I've gotten to capturing engagement with stakeholders and folks outside of academia.
And we have another question in chat, which is about the focus on US universities. We have a lot of participants, of course, who are from outside the US, and they're interested in the extent to which I guess your study could be replicated in other contexts. I gather that you don't have non-US universities in the sample, but presumably it would be possible to replicate in other jurisdictions. And I'm wondering if you think there might be any challenges with that, or whether you would expect any differences in the findings.
Yeah, I've just been working on I have a sabbatical coming up soon, and I'm thinking of going to Leiden in the Netherlands. And I've been reading more and more about at least European science and innovation policy, and Horizon 2020 and whatnot, and trying to think along just these lines. Where in some on some continents or in some countries there may be more or less top down pressure. And here I don't mean just by university presidents, but also from what is the government investing in, right, or interested in or thinking about, and how that might influence just even the sheer distribution of universities' commitments, right? It might shift that whole distribution to a higher level, or maybe truncate the variation, for example. The one drawback, I mean, it's a fun project. It was fun to do, and I think important to do at the university level. It was massive. It took us 2 years. We had 2 20-hour-a-week RAs working, for 2 years to get all the data. And that's the only drawback. Is I think there are probably ways. I would love to extend this to Europe, to Australia, to Oceania. It's just that it's pretty data intensive. And I think it was Mark or maybe Ian who was saying, oh, kind of cool how you had all these qualitative data and then were able to, with the help of computational approaches, kind of distill it just a little bit, right? And develop in most cases some quantitative measures. Yeah, it is really great, but the fact of the matter remains that to extend it, it's just someone could do it on a smaller scale. For example, a select number of universities, right? Let's compare 4 in the US, 4 in Europe, 4 in Australia that are, different and interesting way. Like really create a really cool sampling, right? And then it might be more doable, but it is hard to think about scaling this. Unless you have, 2 years to devote to data collection. Yeah.
So thanks for that, Erin. And another question that might sort of face some of the similar difficulties would be a question that's come through around the potential effects of decreasing commitment to interdisciplinary research. So I guess that's more about if you had a longitudinal study and you could actually track how universities' commitment changes over time and what impact that might have for the consequences, and particularly around funding that you've measured.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love this question. Unfortunately, the data we have cannot get at it, right? And this is, get at decreasing commitment, but it would be fascinating to study. And I'm reminded of the late, I'm a methodologist, the late Stanley Lieberson was a professor at Harvard for many, many years. And he has some interesting work that, just comparing universities that are, high or low, right, isn't really the same as studying a university that goes from high to low, right? And it would be lovely. It would be lovely to do that. That's a great question. Is that Julia? Thank you.
Another question we have here, Erin, relates to the incorporation of non-academic forms of knowledge within the interdisciplinary research that you explored. Did you have any data or evidence around the incorporation, for example, of Indigenous knowledge or local knowledge or lived experience? Would it be possible to explore that in the research centers that as they were coded as interdisciplinary research? Would it be possible to specifically explore for those non-academic forms of knowledge?
Possibly, Rachel. I think that's a really good idea. I think that's probably where, if it did come in, where it could come in, though. We have, I'm trying to think of the actual data we have on centers. There are of course departments as well, right? We have, at my university, we have American Indian Studies, right? Is a department. You can get a degree in American Indian Studies, and centers as well. We have both the names and the kind of descriptors. And I haven't taken a close look at these hundreds and hundreds of descriptors in a couple of years now, but I bet if I went back to them, we might be able to, for what it's worth, right? The descriptors might be able to tell us whether the knowledge being produced and kind of, worked with in that center by people in that center, right, is informed by non-academic knowledge systems, et cetera, connections with communities outside of academia. I can check that out. That's a great idea.
We also have a question here, Erin, about the language of disciplines. The question suggests that language is becoming more and more problematic because of its compartmentalization of knowledge. Is there some other language we could be using other than disciplines, departments, etc.? And what would be that alternative language? That's a hard question, I think.
Very hard question. What is an HOD?
I guess it's head of discipline. I think that might be head of discipline.
Yeah.
How did you, could I ask sort of in your, as you coded and as you coded for disciplines within your research, how did you do that given the boundaries around disciplines is difficult at times to identify?
Yeah. I'll share my screen very briefly to answer that question, Rachel. Let's see. This over. Let's see. Here we go. Come on. Can I do that? Oh no, heavens. Now we're back at the beginning. Hold on. Maybe it'll just be a little smaller. This is the slide I'm trying to share with you. Maybe I say, from current slide. Here we go. Okay. This gives you a sense of our initial effort, like manual coding, traditional manual coding by hand with our own brains, my research team. So by text here, we mean, for example, even the name of the department that's listed on the university webpage and the name of the research center. If the text is likely to be interdisciplinary, if it references the term, synthesis or integration or interdisciplinary, if it references 2 or more disciplines or their stems, for example, geophysics or bioengineering. So this is doesn't automatically tag it as interdisciplinary. This was our kind of human effort. So we look through all these criteria. If it was in the environmental or earth sciences, like atmospheric and oceanic sciences, for example, any of the following STEM words in combination with studies. So American studies, cultural studies, Islamic studies, etc. A lot of the work done in professional schools, right, is inherently kind of cross-disciplinary. So this just gives you a sense of some of the things, the kind of considerations that we used when coding departments and centers. And I think that this great question, one of the ways we get at this a little bit is by coding, Rachel, like you said, coding the centers and the departments as interdisciplinary or not. And then looking at that relative amount, right? Okay, they have a lot of departments, but how many of them are actually interdisciplinary according to these kind of criteria in our assessment aided by machine learning? And same with research centers. That's probably the closest we would and could get to that. Changing language, yeah, wow. I think people have been trying to do this for a really long time. There's another university in my state here in Arizona, and the president for a while, I mean, there was no Department of Sociology. He just did away with departments and said, we're only having these very large schools, and they have names like the School of Social Transformation, the School of Sustainability, right? And within them, there's all sorts of faculty, and people have PhDs in different disciplines, right? But it really wasn't a kind of codified and normalized way of categorizing work and people and students and degrees and things like that. And now it's changing. Now apparently they're bringing back a Department of Sociology, or just did in the last few years. So yeah, these things are hard to change. I think even if we still use disciplines or departments, I think maybe what we mean by discipline or department is changing, even if we're still using those terms.
Great, thanks, Erin. And I think I'm just going to slip in. Actually, I noticed Ian. Okay, I'm going to let Ian ask the last question. Ian.
I appreciate that. Yes, I have. Thanks. I'll just put my screen, my video on again. Apologies. Yeah, it's COVID. One of the things that we've seen in Australia is a sort of retreat to the disciplines, with centres being stopped within university systems, and it's one of the things that we're thinking about putting some writing towards from the Nitro area. And I'm wondering whether you're seeing the same thing in the US. It's like it's almost like, you know, a feeling of safety and security within the disciplinary framework, and that the sort of centers and institutes are things that are a luxury, a Cinderella that
Extra.
we don't necessarily need.
I have not noticed that yet in the United. I haven't paid much attention to it. I also think that once things, there's a lot of kind of inertia and path dependency. And once something exists, it kind of still exists, and it's at least still on the books. And maybe it's not receiving quite the funding or the person power that it did in the past. So I think you're right. I think you're right that probably the pandemic is having the same effect. I mean, we heard from my university's only $84 million in the hole last year. They were expecting $250 million in the hole, right? And there's, you know, we're being furloughed and right, it's tough times all around. And so the luxuries are often the first things to go, right? Understandably, yeah. But hopefully it's not a permanent thing.
Yeah, my worry is that interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity are seen as luxuries.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
rather than necessities.
Yes. I have not seen evidence of that. Yet. There still seems to be a whole lot of interest in that, as well as making these connections beyond academia, right, with industry and government, indigenous communities. That seems to be growing in the United States. So fingers crossed.
So Erin, we probably do have time quickly for me to ask the final question that came through on chat, and that's from somebody in Indonesia who's really interested in the research, but is making the point that the data that would be available for universities in Indonesia would be much more limited. Do you have any advice around how he or she may be able to manage that?
I'm happy to talk. Wirastuti. Maybe send me an email. I don't think I'm still sharing my screen anymore. I don't know. I can't tell, but just reach out to me and I'm happy to brainstorm. It's one of my most favorite things to do. That would be fun.
Well, thank you very much, Erin. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. And I'd like to thank you very much for providing us with such valuable insights and for stimulating such a lively discussion from such a wide range of people have contributed to the questions. So thank you also to all of the participants. And we look forward to your involvement in Nitro events in the future. Thanks very much, Erin.
Thank you.
I'm not sure how we show appreciation on Zoom. I think there's a chat, there's a clap function somewhere, but yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Gabrielle, for the introduction, for the invitation, everyone for your comments. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Yeah, you have a great evening. See you later.
Take care. Bye-bye.